Northern France. Inside a U.S. Army command post, the front line no longer matches the map. Radio operators check coordinates again. Staff officers lean over the table. Something is wrong, not tactically, not strategically, structurally. General Omar Bradley asks a simple question. Where is Patton? The answer doesn't fit inside the boundaries drawn by Supreme Headquarters. It doesn't fit inside Bradley's orders. And it doesn't fit inside the rules of Allied command. George S. Patton's Third Army has pushed forward 30 miles beyond its assigned limit. No approval, no updated boundary, no pause. On paper, this is insubordination. In reality, it is something far more dangerous. Because when an army outruns its orders, command collapses first. Fuel lines stretch thin, flanks open, coordination breaks. And for the first time since Normandy, Bradley realizes he no longer fully controls the fastest army in Europe. This is not a story about rebellion. It is a story about speed, authority, and the day command nearly broke under victory itself. By August 1944, the war in Western Europe had changed speed faster than Allied planning could absorb. The Normandy landings were no longer the story. The hedgerows had been shattered. German defensive lines in northern France had collapsed under pressure from Operation Cobra, and the Allied armies were no longer fighting to break out. They were fighting to keep up with their own momentum. At the center of that momentum stood General George S. Patton. Patton's U.S. Third Army had been activated on August 1, 1944, under the command structure of General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. On paper, the hierarchy was clear. Eisenhower commanded the theater. Bradley controlled the American armies. Patton executed operations within assigned boundaries. But warfare on the ground does not move on paper. Patton's doctrine was simple and brutally consistent. Never give the enemy time to recover. German units retreating from Normandy were disorganized, short on fuel, and often leaderless. Patton believed that hesitation, even for logistical consolidation, would allow German forces to regroup behind rivers and urban chokepoints. So the Third Army surged east and north across France with unprecedented speed. Towns fell in hours instead of days. Bridges were seized intact. German rear guards dissolved before contact. For American troops, it felt like pursuit, not combat. For Allied headquarters, it felt like a problem forming. Because speed created distance, and distance created risk. The faster Patton moved, the farther his formation stretched from fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and adjacent Allied units. Communications lagged behind movement. Maps were outdated within a day. Boundaries agreed upon in headquarters were meaningless on roads controlled by advance elements already miles ahead. Bradley understood momentum. He had helped engineer it. But Bradley also understood command responsibility. Every mile Patton advanced beyond coordination increased the danger of exposed flanks, friendly fire incidents, and operational isolation. Allied armies were not advancing evenly. British and Canadian forces in the north were slowed by heavy fighting. Supply lines still ran back to Normandy beaches. Patton's army was becoming faster than the system designed to control it. And somewhere ahead of Bradley's authority, that imbalance was about to reveal itself. Because the moment Patton crossed his boundary, the issue was no longer speed, it was control. The Allied advance in late August 1944 was no longer limited by German resistance. It was limited by gasoline. Every American tank, truck, and artillery piece moving across France depended on a supply system still anchored to the beaches of Normandy. The ports that planners expected to use, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, were either contested or unusable. Rail lines were wrecked. Roads were congested with traffic moving in every direction. To keep the advance alive, the U.S. Army improvised. The Red Ball Express became the artery of the Allied pursuit. Thousands of trucks ran day and night, hauling fuel forward at enormous cost in wear, breakdowns, and exhaustion. Even at peak output, it could not fully supply every advancing formation. Command decisions now became zero-sum. Fuel allocated to one army was fuel denied to another. If Patton's Third Army moved faster, someone else would slow down. Eisenhower and Bradley had to balance pressure across the entire front, not just reward speed in one sector. Boundaries were drawn to enforce that balance. Operational limits were not meant to restrain success. They were meant to prevent catastrophe. If one army surged too far ahead, it risked German counterattacks against its exposed sides or accidental collisions with neighboring Allied units operating under different plans. Patton understood these arguments. He simply believed they no longer applied. German forces in front of Third Army were collapsing faster than intelligence reports could track. Prisoners spoke of retreat orders, not defensive lines. Patton's reconnaissance units reported open roads and abandoned equipment. To him, stopping for fuel coordination meant allowing the enemy to breathe. Bradley, however, saw a different picture. He saw a front stretching thin. He saw armies operating on parallel axes without firm lateral contact. He saw the political consequences of a single disaster, an American army cut off deep inside France because it had outrun its fuel. So when boundaries were set, they were meant to be obeyed. Yet Patton's forward elements continued to push beyond those invisible lines. 30 miles was not a symbolic number. It represented hours of movement without permission. It represented divisions operating beyond the zone where Bradley could guarantee support. And when reports reached headquarters that Third Army units were no longer where they were supposed to be, Bradley faced a reality no commander wants to confront. He did not know exactly where his fastest army was. At that moment, command was no longer theoretical. It was slipping. And the crisis would come not from enemy fire, but from the distance between authority and action. The moment did not arrive with explosions or gunfire. It arrived with a report that did not align with the map. Inside Bradley's headquarters, staff officers traced Third Army's reported positions with grease pencils. The marks pushed forward, then farther, then past the boundary line that had been agreed upon and distributed. There was no ambiguity. Patton's advance elements were operating 30 miles beyond their assigned limit. This was not a patrol pushing too far. It was not a temporary reconnaissance thrust. Entire formations were now committed beyond the zone Bradley was responsible for controlling. The implications were immediate. Fuel convoys assigned to other armies were being redirected on the road by Third Army units. Communications became fragmented as Corps headquarters struggled to keep contact with divisions moving faster than relay stations could be established. Adjacent units no longer shared clear lateral boundaries. If the Germans counterattacked now, no one could guarantee who would respond or how quickly. Bradley understood Patton's instinct. He had selected him for Third Army precisely because of his aggressiveness. But command was not a personality contest. It was a system built on predictability, coordination, and restraint when necessary. Patton, meanwhile, saw only opportunity. His intelligence officers reported German units retreating in disorder. Roadblocks were thin. Bridges remained intact. Every hour of delay, in his view, allowed German forces to reconstitute behind rivers and urban defenses. Patton did not believe he was disobeying the spirit of the campaign. He believed he was saving it. But from Bradley's position, intent no longer mattered. Once Patton crossed the boundary without authorization, control itself was at risk. Bradley could not confidently brief Eisenhower on the exact disposition of American forces. He could not guarantee support if Third Army encountered serious resistance. He could not ensure that Patton's push would not destabilize the entire Allied front. This was the moment when authority was tested, not by an enemy general, but by one of his own. Orders were drafted, communications were sent. The message was clear: the advance had gone too far. But Patton's army was already moving. And momentum, once unleashed, does not stop easily. The question now was no longer whether Patton had crossed the line, but whether Bradley could pull him back without breaking the advance entirely. Bradley's response was measured, but the stakes were not. Messages were relayed through Army and Corps headquarters, instructing Third Army to halt further unauthorized advances and realign with assigned boundaries. Fuel allocations were reviewed. Priority routes were clarified. Control, at least on paper, was being reasserted. But the battlefield does not pause while headquarters recalibrates. Patton's forward units were already engaged across a widening front. Reconnaissance battalions were probing ahead. Armored columns were committed to crossings and road junctions that could not be abandoned without consequence. A sudden halt risked chaos just as surely as overextension. This was the paradox Bradley faced. To stop Patton abruptly might fracture the momentum that had unbalanced German defenses. To allow him to continue risked operational disaster and the erosion of command authority across the entire American force. Higher command took notice. Eisenhower had built his leadership on coalition discipline. British and Canadian commanders were watching closely. If an American Army commander could disregard boundaries without consequence, it would strain Allied unity and undermine the carefully managed balance of the front. Patton's reputation amplified the problem. He was not an anonymous general. He was already a symbol, admired by soldiers, feared by enemies, scrutinized by allies. Any corrective action would be visible, and any perceived favoritism would echo across the command structure. Meanwhile, German resistance, stiffened in places Patton's advance had not expected. Rear guards began to fight harder. Demolitions appeared on key routes. Fuel shortages slowed armored spearheads at the worst possible moment, deep in territory without secure flanks. The danger Bradley had feared was no longer hypothetical. Third Army was extended. Supplies were uncertain. Coordination with neighboring units was strained. Bradley did not lose control in a dramatic confrontation. He lost it quietly, in increments. Each mile Patton advanced beyond authorization, narrowing the space in which Bradley could effectively command. Eventually, operational reality imposed its own correction. Fuel ran low, advances slowed, boundaries were reasserted not by argument but by logistics. Patton's army did not collapse. It survived the risk it had taken. But the incident left a mark. It demonstrated that speed could outpace authority, and that even success could destabilize command if left unchecked. The advance continued, but the cost of that moment would only become clear after the front settled and the consequences were counted. When the front finally slowed, the consequences of Patton's unauthorized advance came into focus, not as a single verdict, but as a series of adjustments that reshaped Allied operations. On the ground, Third Army had gained territory at remarkable speed. Large swaths of eastern France were liberated with minimal fighting. German units retreating from Normandy were pushed beyond their capacity to reorganize. In purely tactical terms, Patton's instincts had not been wrong. But tactical success did not erase operational strain. Fuel shortages became acute. Third Army's armored divisions frequently halted not because of enemy resistance, but because tanks ran dry. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Medical evacuation routes stretched longer with each mile of advance. Units that had moved fastest were often the most vulnerable. Bradley took steps to reassert command without triggering a public rupture. Boundaries were clarified and enforced more rigidly. Supply allocations were centralized. Corps commanders were reminded, quietly but firmly, that initiative did not replace authorization. The message was not aimed at Patton alone. It was meant to stabilize the system before similar risks multiplied across the front. There was no court-martial, no public reprimand. But there was recalibration. Patton's freedom of maneuver was constrained in subtle ways. Fuel priorities shifted as Eisenhower balanced pressure across British, Canadian, and American sectors. The grand strategy demanded cohesion, not competition. For Bradley, the incident reinforced a lesson forged under pressure. Modern war was no longer a series of independent charges led by aggressive commanders. It was an industrial system. Armies were not judged solely by how far they advanced, but by whether they could be sustained, coordinated, and controlled across hundreds of miles. German commanders, observing the Allied advance, noted the vulnerabilities as well as the power. They could not stop the Allies outright, but they could exploit pauses, supply gaps, and exposed flanks. Each overextended thrust created opportunities for localized resistance and counterattack. The episode also shaped internal perceptions. Staff officers became more cautious in tracking and reporting forward movements. Intelligence summaries placed greater emphasis on logistics rather than enemy body counts. Maps were updated more frequently, but with clearer boundary markings. Patton remained Patton. He continued to press whenever opportunity appeared, but the system around him grew tighter, more resistant to unilateral movement. Bradley did not seek to break his most aggressive commander. He sought to contain him, because victory was no longer measured by kilometers gained in a day, but by whether the Allied front could reach Germany intact. And that calculation would soon face its greatest test. As winter approached and German resistance hardened, the balance between speed and control would be challenged again. Under far more dangerous conditions, war rewards speed. But it punishes anyone who mistakes speed for control. In August 1944, George S. Patton proved how quickly an army could outrun the enemy. He also proved how easily it could outrun its own command. Omar Bradley did not lose control because Patton was reckless. He lost it because victory arrived faster than the system designed to manage it. The 30 miles Patton advanced beyond his orders did not collapse the front. It did something more revealing. It exposed the thin line between initiative and instability, between decisive action and strategic risk. Modern war is not won by a single commander's instincts, no matter how brilliant. It is won by coordination, fuel moving when it must, units aligned when it matters, authority holding even when momentum tempts disobedience. Patton's advance worked because the enemy was already broken. It was dangerous because the system behind him was not yet rebuilt. Bradley understood that distinction. He did not stop Patton to assert ego. He stopped him to preserve the war effort itself. History often remembers the generals who move the fastest. It rarely remembers the ones who prevent momentum from turning into catastrophe. But without control, speed becomes chaos. And without restraint, even victory can unravel. That is why this moment matters. Because the day Patton crossed the line was not a rebellion. It was a warning, written in miles, fuel, and command, that war is not just about how far you advance, but whether the army behind you can follow.